Hello everybody, welcome back to History of Spriggs. My name is Spriggs. Well, I should say Christmas Spriggs because today we have a Christmas special. The Battle of Trenton. Well, let's get right into the video. In early December 1776, American morale was very low. The Americans had been ousted from New York by the British and their Hessian auxiliaries at the Battle of Long Island. And the Continental Army was forced to retreat across New Jersey, and 90% of the Continental Army soldiers who had served at Long Island were gone. Men had deserted, feeling that the cause for independence was lost. Washington, commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, even expressed some doubts, writing to his cousin in Virginia, "I think the game is pretty near up." At the time, a small town in New Jersey, Trenton, was occupied by 4 regiments of Hessian soldiers, numbering about 1,400 men, commanded by Colonel Johann Rall. Washington's force comprised of 2,400 men, with infantry divisions commanded by Major Generals Nathaniel Greene and John Sullivan, and artillery under the direction of Brigadier General Henry Knox. And George Washington had stationed a spy named John Honeyman, posted as a British loyalist in Trenton. Honeyman had served with Major General James Wolfe in Quebec at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham on September 13, 1759, and had no trouble establishing his credentials as a loyalist. Honeyman was a butcher and bartender who traded with British and Hessians. This enabled him to gather intelligence and to convince the Hessians that the Continental Army was in such a low state of morale that they would not attack. Trenton, shortly before Christmas, he arranged to be captured by the Continental Army, who had orders to bring him to Washington unharmed. After being questioned by Washington, he was imprisoned in a hut to be tried as a loyalist in the morning, but a small fire broke out nearby, enabling him to escape. On the evening before the battle, Hessian commander Rall was celebrating Christmas with his troops at a farm of Abraham Hunt, a wealthy merchant and farmer of Trenton. Hunt played the role of a friendly loyalist host, giving Rall a false sense of serenity while Washington and his troops were preparing for a surprise attack. The U.S. plan relied on launching coordinated attacks from 3 directions, with General John Cadwalader would attack and launch a divisionary attack against the British garrison at Bordentown, New Jersey, to block off reinforcements from the south, and General James Ewing would take 700 militia across the river at Trenton Ferry, seize the bridge over the Assunpink River, and prevent enemy troops from north of Trenton, and split into 2 groups under Major Greene and under Sullivan to launch a pre-dawn attack. Sullivan would attack the town from the south and Greene from the north. And depending on the success of the operation, the Americans would possibly follow up with a separate attacks on Princeton, New Brunswick. During the week before the battle, U.S. advance parties began to ambush the enemy cavalry patrols, capturing dispatch riders and attacking Hessian pickets. Hessian to emphasize the danger his men were facing, sent 100 infantry and an artillery detachment to deliver a letter to the British commander at Princeton. Washington ordered Ewing and his Pennsylvania militia to try and gain information on Hessian movements and technology. Ewing instead made 3 successful raids across the river. One on December 17th and another on December 18th, 1776. They attacked an outpost of Hager's, and on the 21st, they set fire to several houses. Washington put constant watches on all possible crossings near the Continental Army encampment on the Delaware, as he believed William Howe would launch an attack from north on Philadelphia if the river froze over. On December 20th, 1776, some 2,000 troops led by General Sullivan arrived in Washington's camp. They had been under the command of Charles Lee and had been moving slowly through northern New Jersey when Lee was captured. That same day, an additional 800 troops arrived from Fort Ticonderoga under the command of Horatio Gates. On December 14, 1776, the Hessians arrived in Trenton to establish their winter quarters. At the time, Trenton was a small town with about 100 houses and two main streets, Keene Street, now Warren Street, and Queen Street, now Broad Street. Karl von Denab, Royal Superior, had marched south to Mount Holly on December 22nd to deal with the resistance in New Jersey and had clashed with some New Jersey militia there on December 23rd. Denab, who despised Rawle, was reluctant to give command of Trenton to him. Rawle was known to be loud and unacquainted with the English language, but he was also a 36-year veteran with a great deal of battle experience. His request for reinforcements had been turned down by British commander General James Grant, who thought the American rebels were poor soldiers. Despite Rawle's experience, the Hessians at Trenton did not admire their commander. Trenton lacked city walls, or even fortifications, which was typical of U.S. settlements. Some Hessian soldiers advised Rawle to fortify the town, and two of his engineers advised him that a redoubt be built at the upper end of the town and fortifications be built along the river. The engineers went so far as to draw up plans, but Rawle disagreed with them. When Rawle was again urged to fortify the town, he replied, "Let them come. We will go at them with the bayonet." As Christmas approached, Loyalists came to Trenton to report the Americans were planning action. U.S. deserters told the Hessians that rations were being prepared for an advance across the river. Rawle publicly dismissed such talk as nonsense, but privately in letters to his superiors he said he was worried about an imminent attack. He wrote to Denab that he was liable to be attacked at any moment. Rawle said that Trenton was indefensible and asked the British troops to establish a garrison in Maidenhead, which is now Lawrenceville, close to Trenton. This would help defend the roads from Americans. His request was denied, as the Americans disrupted Hessian supply lines. The officers started to share Rawle's fears. One wrote, "We have not slept one night in peace since we came to this place." On December 22nd, 1776, a spy reported to Grant that Washington had called a council of war. Grant told Rawle to be on your guard. The main Hessian force of 1,500 men was divided into three regiments: Nijmegen, Losberg, and Rawle. That night, they did not send out any patrols because of the severe weather. Before Washington and his troops left, Benjamin Rush came to cheer up the general. Well, his words would be the password, and he saw a note Washington had written saying "victory or death." Those words would be a password for the surprise attack. Each soldier carried 60 rounds of ammunition and 3 days' worth of rations. When the army arrived at the shores of the Delaware, they were already behind schedule. The clouds began to form above them, and it began to rain. As the air temperature dropped, the rain changed to sleet and then to snow. The Americans began to cross the river with John Glover in command. The men went across in Durham boats, while the horses and artillery went on large ferries. The 14th Continental Regiment of Glover manned boats. During the crossing, several men fell overboard, including Colonel John Haslett. Haslett was quickly mated out over in good no one died during the crossing, and Haslett was immediately pulled out of the water, and the artillery pieces made it over in good condition. 2 small detachments of infantry of about 40 men each were ordered ahead of main columns, but they set roadblocks ahead of the main army and were to take prisoner of whoever came into or left the town. One of the groups was sent to the Delaware north of Trenton, and the other was sent to Block River Road, which ran along the Delaware River, to Trenton. The terrible weather conditions delayed the landings in New Jersey until 3 a.m. The plan was that they were supposed to be completed by 12 a.m. Washington realized it would be impossible to launch a pre-dawn attack. Another setback occurred for the Americans as Generals Cadwalader and Ewing were unable to join the attack because of the weather conditions. At 4 a.m., the soldiers began to march towards Trenton. Along the way, several civilians joined as volunteers and led as guides, such as John Mott, because of their knowledge of the terrain. After marching 1.5 miles through the winding roads into the wind, they reached Bear Tavern, where they turned south onto Bear Tavern Road. The ground was slippery, but it was level, making it easier for the horses and artillery. They began to make better time. They soon reached Jacob's Creek, where, with difficulty, the Americans made the cross. The 2 groups stayed together until they reached Birmingham, now West Trenton, where Scott and Pennington Roads and Sullivan's heading southwest to approach via River Road. Soon after, they reached the house of Benjamin Moore, where the family offered food and drink to Washington. At this point, the first signs of daylight began to appear. Many of the troops did not have boots, so they were forced to wear rags around their feet. Some of the men's feet bled, turning the snow into a dark red. 2 men died on the march. As they marched, Washington rode up and down down the line, encouraging the men to continue. General Sullivan sent a courier to tell Washington that the weather was wetting his men's gunpowder. Washington replied, "Tell General Sullivan to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton." About 2 miles outside the town, the main columns reunited with the advance parties. They were stalled by a sudden appearance of 50 armed men, but they were American, led by Adam Stephen. They had not known about the plan to attack Trenton and had attacked the Hessian outpost. Washington feared the Hessians would have been put on guard and shouted at Stephen, you sir may have ruined all my plans by having them put on their guard." Despite this, Washington ordered the advance to continue to Trenton, and Washington was very, very determined to take Trenton, as you can see. In the event, Rawle thought the first raid was the attack, which Grant had warned him about, and that there would be no further action that day. At 8 a.m. on the morning of December 26th, the Hessians established an outpost at a cooper shop on Pennington Road, about 1 mile northeast of Trenton, and Washington then led the assault on it, riding in front of his soldiers as they as the Hessian commander of the outpost, Lieutenant Andreas Wetterhold, left the shop. An American fired at him but missed. Wetterhold immediately shouted, "Der Feind," which means the enemy in German. The other Hessians came out. The Americans fired 3 volleys, and the Hessians returned one of their own. Washington ordered Edward Hand's Pennsylvania riflemen and a battalion of German-speaking infantry to block the roads that led to Princeton. They attacked the Hessian outpost there. Wetterhold realized that this was more than a raiding party. Seeing other Hessians retreating from the outpost, he led his men to do the same. Both Hessian detachments made organized retreats, firing as they fell back on the high ground at the north end of Trenton. They were joined by a duty company from the Lossberg Regiment. They engaged the Americans, retreating slowly, keeping up continuous fire, and using houses for cover. Once in Trenton, they gained covering fire from other Hessian Guard companies on the outskirts of the town, and another Guard company near to the Delaware River rushes to their aid, leaving open the river road into Trenton. Washington ordered the escape route to Princeton to be cut off, sending infantry in battle formation to block it. While artillery formed at the head of Keene and Queen Streets, leading the southern U.S. column, General Sullivan entered Trenton by the abandoned river road and blocked the only crossing over the Assunpink River, or Creek, to cut off the Hessian escape. Sullivan briefly held up his advance to make sure Greene's division had time to drive the Hessians from their outposts in the north. Soon after, they continued their advance, attacking the Hermitage, home of Philemon Dickinson, where 50 Hagers under the command of Lieutenant von Grothausen were stationed. Lieutenant von Grothausen brought 12 of his Hagers into action against the advance guard, but had only advanced a few hundred yards when he saw a column of Americans advancing to the Hermitage. Pulling back to the Hessian barracks, he was joined by the rest of the Hagers. After the exchange of one volley, they turned back and ran, some trying to swim across the creek while others escaped over the bridge, which had not yet been cut off. The 20 British dragoons also fled as Greene and Sullivan's columns pushed into the town. Washington moved to the high ground on the north of Keene and Queen Streets to see the action and direct his troops. By the time U.S. artillery from the north side of the Delaware River had come into action, devastating the Hessian positions, with the sounding of the alarm, the 3 Hessian regiments began to prepare for battle. The Roll Regiment formed on Lower Keene Street, along with the Lossberg Regiment, while the Knyphausen Regiment formed at the lower end of Queen Street. Lieutenant Peel, Rawls' brigade adjutant, woke his commander, who found that the rebels had taken the V of the main streets of the town. This is where the engineers had recommended building a redoubt. Rawls ordered his regiment to form up at the lower end of Keene Street, and the Lossberg Regiment to prepare for an advance up Queen Street, and the Knyphausen Regiment to stand by as a reserve for Rawls' advance up Keene Street. The U.S. cannon stationed at the head of the 2 main streets soon came into action in reply. Rawls directed his regiments, supported by a few companies of the Lossberg Regiment, to clear the guns. The Hessians formed ranks and began to advance up the street. but their formations were quickly broken by U.S. guns and fire from Mercer's men, who had taken houses on the left side of the street. Breaking ranks, the Hessians fled. Rall ordered 2 3-pound cannons into action. After getting off 6 rounds each, within just a few minutes, half of the Hessians manning their guns were killed by the U.S. cannon. After the men fled to cover behind the houses and fences, their cannons were taken by the Americans. Following capture of the cannons, the men under the command of George Weed advanced down Queen Street. All Hessian attempts to advance up the street were repulsed by guns under the command of Thomas Forrest. After firing 4 rounds each, 2 more Hessian guns were silenced. One of Forrest's howitzers was put out of action with a broken axle. The Knyphausen Regiment became separated from the Lossberg and the Rall regiments. The Lossberg and Rall regiments fell back to a field outside the town, taking heavy losses from grape shot and musket fire. In the southern part of the town, Americans under the command of Sullivan began to overwhelm the Hessians. John Stark led a bayonet charge at the Knyphausen Regiment, whose resistance broke because of their weapons would not fire. Sullivan led a column of men to block the escape of troops across the creek. The Hessians in the field attempted to reorganize and make one last attempt to retake the town so they could make a breakout. Rall decided to attack the Hessians. The U.S. flank on the heights north of the town. Rall yelled, "Forward, advance, advance," and the Hessians began to move, with the brigade's band playing fifes, bugles, and drums to help the Hessian spirit. Washington, still on high ground, saw the Hessians approaching the U.S. flank, and he moved his troops to assume battle formation against the enemy. The 2 Hessian regiments began advancing toward Queen Street, but were caught in enemy fire that came at them from 3 directions. Some Americans had taken up defensive positions inside houses, reducing their exposure. Some civilians had joined the fight against the Hessians. Despite this, they continued to push, recapturing their cannons at the head of Queen Street. Knox saw the Hessians had retaken their cannons and ordered his troops to take them. 6 men ran, and after a brief struggle seized the cannons, turning them on the Hessians. With most of the Hessians unable to fire their guns, the attack stalled. The Hessian formations broke, and they began to scatter. Rall was mortally wounded. Washington led his troops down from the high ground while yelling, "March on, my brave fellows, after me." Most of the Hessians retreated into an orchard with the Americans in close pursuit. Quickly surrounded, the Hessians were offered terms of surrender, to which they agreed. Although ordered to join Rall, the remains of the Knyphausen regiment mistakenly marched on the opposite direction. They tried to escape across the bridge, but found it had been taken. The Americans quickly swept in, defeating the Hessian attempt to break through their lines. Surrounded by Sullivan's men, the regiment surrendered just minutes after the rest of the brigade. Overall, the Hessian forces lost 22 killed in action, including their commander, Colonel Johann Rall, 83 wounded, and 896 captured, including the wounded. The Americans, although, only suffered overall only 2 deaths. Future President James Monroe, this included future President James Monroe with a near-fatal shoulder wound, and 5 Americans were wounded in battle too. Other losses incurred by the Patriots from exhaustion, exposure, and illness in the following days may have raised their fatalities above those of the Hessians. The captured Hessians were sent to Philadelphia and later Lancaster in 1777. They were moved to Virginia, and Rahl was mortally wounded and died later that night at his headquarters. All 4 Hessian colonels in Trenton were killed in battle. The Louisburg Regiment was effectively removed from the British forces, and parts of the Kniphausen Regiment escaped to the south, but Sullivan captured some 200 additional men, along with the regiment's cannons and supplies. They also captured approximately 1,000 arms and much-needed ammunition. The Americans also captured their entire store of provisions, and it had tons of flour, dried and salted meats, ale, and other liquors, as well as shoes, boots, clothing, and bedding. And these things were as much needed by the ragtag Continental forces as weapons and horses. And you have to understand with this, these were Hessians, a part of the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, and the Germans took Christmas very seriously, and they would normally drink, and so, although it's debated among historians, they probably got drunk the night before in Christmas, and the next morning woke up tired and exhausted, and totally not ready to fight a battle that was already against the odds. And so, this could be part of the downfall, although it is debated among historians. Well, thanks for watching this Christmas special. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have a comment or something to say, comment down below. And make sure to subscribe to History of Sprigs, and like and share it with a friend. If they won't listen, share it with an enemy. And with that being said, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays, and Sprigs out.